Today is Friday, December 14, 2018, and you're tuned into The Revolution. In today's episode, you'll be hearing two articles that appear in this week's edition of Revolution newspaper, as updated on the website revcom.us, the voice of the Revolutionary Communist Party, USA. First, on the death of George H.W. Bush, let the dead bury their dead. Humanity needs revolution and communism. Also today, the nostalgia for George H.W. Bush and the dream of a kinder, gentler imperialism. On the death of George H.W. Bush, let the dead bury their dead. Humanity needs revolution and communism. The ceremonies surrounding the death of George H.W. Bush, like the ones around John McCain a few months ago, again brought out the sharp contradictions among different sections of the capitalist imperialist rulers over how to resolve the crises they face. And it brought out as well the news organs of the liberal bourgeoisie to mourn the quote-unquote days of the patricians, when there was civility and respect between political opponents within the government based on love of country. On one side sat Trump, stone-faced, representing the fascist future now being bolted into place. The solution that he and his regime, including Pence, represent is extreme and brutally ugly, and is one possible solution to these crises. On the other side were those there to celebrate Bush and his era as one in which the institutions of the ruling class could be used to forge consensus, and by implication to criticize Trump for breaking the norms represented by Bush. In actual fact, in George Bush they were celebrating 70-plus years of bloody service to imperialism, a record in which Bush himself ordered or was deeply involved in the killing of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people. Beneath the nostalgia for Bush's politeness, good humor, and decency, whether real, imagined, or exaggerated, they were objectively nostalgic for the quote-unquote order that Bush helped enforce, nostalgic for the days of ruling class unity he represented. And all the while the drumbeat of horror was on the world's split screen, children starving from a US-backed war in Yemen, report after report being issued showing that the imperialists are accelerating the drive to ecological destruction, increasingly sharp contention between the US and China, and attacks across the board within the U.S. on basic civil and human rights in the rule of law. Neither side of this funeral party has any answer fit for humanity. To be clear, the conflicts within the ruling class are significant and can be made use of if there is a struggle from below of masses of people fighting for their own interests. But the main thing is, there is a solution to this madness. This whole system needs to be swept away through revolution, and a better one put in its place. A different and far better world is possible. Revolution and communism, the new communism, brought forward by Bob Avakian. There is the science, the strategy, and the leadership for an actual revolution, and a radically new society on the road to real emancipation. A better world is possible, and you have a role to play in bringing it into being. The nostalgia for George H.W. Bush and the dream of a kinder, gentler imperialism. In the week just past, the treatment of the death of George H.W. Bush called forth the hope of a quote-unquote kinder, gentler America. But do the facts back up those hopes. Let's start with this. In 1988, an Iranian commercial airliner, flying its normal route in Iranian airspace, was shot down by a U.S. Navy ship illegally operating in Iranian waters. 290 people, including 66 children, were killed. And what was then Vice President Bush's reaction? Quote, "I will never apologize for the United States. I don't care what the facts are." End quote. If you're the leader of a country where the facts are that it enslaved tens of millions of African people for centuries, that it committed genocide against millions of Native Americans and then stole the lands of the rest, that it dropped the only 2 nuclear weapons that ever have been dropped on 2 Japanese cities with no military installations, and then went on to kill millions in Korea in the 1950s and millions more in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, along with other crimes too numerous to mention, all to ensure that the rulers of this country could exploit and plunder whoever and whatever they could get their hands on, then it probably makes sense to never apologize and to ignore, cover over, or just not care about what the facts are. But if you really want a better world, you do have to look at the facts. Leaving aside his stint as head of the CIA in 1976, Bush came to the top levels of national power in 1980 as vice president and then ruled as president from 1989 to 1993. Though we could fill a whole edition of RevCom.us with the crimes of U.S. imperialism that George Herbert Walker Bush participated in his years working with the CIA, and briefly as head of the CIA, and in many positions he held as a quote-unquote diplomat, in close proximity to brutal efforts to suppress people around the world. In 1989, shortly after coming to office, Bush launched war against Panama. The de facto leader of Panama, Manuel Noriega, had been someone who'd worked with the CIA but then run afoul of the U.S. when he was rumored to have become a double agent for Cuba. After Noriega annulled an election in Panama, Bush sent more American troops to guard the U.S.-owned canal there. When an off-duty U.S. Marine was killed, Bush launched an invasion. This invasion included wholesale massacres in El Chorillo, a poor neighborhood where support for the Panamanian President Noriega ran high. U.S. air power pulverized El Chorillo from the air until it looked like, quote-unquote, little Hiroshima. Then U.S. troops moved through burning building by building, shooting the inhabitants in the streets, piling the dead and wounded together in heaps. At least hundreds of civilians, perhaps more, were killed in El Chorillo alone. Flush with that quote-unquote victory, Bush went on to wage the first Gulf War against Iraq in 1990 to 1991. Iraq had occupied Kuwait after what was at least an ambiguous signal from the U.S. ambassador that it would not be opposed if it did so. Bush moved to marshal an international fighting force against Iraq, in part on the basis of a campaign of outright lies about Iraqi troops having ripped babies from incubators in Kuwait, and an imminent Iraqi invasion of Saudi Arabia. Quickly routing the vastly out-armed Iraqi forces, the U.S. used overwhelming air power to rain death on a retreating caravan of Iraqi soldiers, many of whom had abandoned their military vehicles, as well as on Kuwaiti civilians. At least 25,000 retreating Iraqi soldiers were slaughtered, many on what became known as the Highway of Death. The White House declared the dead to be, quote, torturers, looters, and rapists, end quote. During the war, the U.S. Air Force deliberately devastated Iraq's civilian infrastructure, water purification plants, flour mills, power plants, leading to malnutrition and outbreaks of cholera and typhoid. One Census Bureau demographer estimated that by January 1992, some 70,000 Iraqi civilians had died due mainly to the destruction of water and power plants. And yes, Bush did, as vice president under Reagan, and then as president, play a major role in formulating a full-court press against its main imperialist rival in the world, the Soviet Union, which, along with a severe internal crisis, led to its collapse and the reintegration of much of its bloc into the U.S. empire. But this did not happen without a shot, as Barack and Michelle Obama claimed in a formal statement on Bush's death, but through a decades-long bloody campaign of coups, interventions, and regional wars against Soviet interests on several continents. Wars in which at least hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, and countries and regions like Central America, Afghanistan, and Southern Africa were driven from the regular grinding oppression under imperialist thumbs into a straight-up nightmarish existence of war and ruin. All this took place in the context and was set against a backdrop of a massive U.S. nuclear buildup that at different points brought the world to the brink of possible nuclear annihilation. For example, see these articles in the RevCom.us American Crime Series. Operation Condor, 1968 to 1980s. U.S.-directed campaign of political assassination and state terror in Latin America. And the 1973 CIA coup in Chile. 1,000 points of what? Bush was eulogized for trying to bring light to America and for refusing to demonize whole sections of people as Trump does. Again, though, what are the facts? Bush became president in 1988 after one of the dirtiest campaigns of those times against the Democrat Michael Dukakis. There were slanders and lies, but the most notorious was the Willie Horton ad. This ad featured a black prisoner who, while on furlough in Massachusetts, raped a white woman. While not officially sponsored by the campaign, Bush's campaign manager and protege Lee Atwater had bragged that he was going to make America think that Willie Horton was Dukakis's running mate. The ad helped Bush get elected, but more fundamentally, it served the ruling class program of demonizing black people at a time when the system was furiously heightening the mass incarceration of black and Latino masses. Bush continued the war on drugs, which during the Reagan administration included not just vicious criminalization and repression rained down against black and Latino people, but the continued pumping of drugs into the ghettos and barrios, including during his vice presidency with, at minimum, the cooperation of high-ranking members of the Reagan administration. During Bush's time in office, as vice president and then president, the federal prisoner population nearly tripled, with 60% black or Latino. The sheer amount of suffering embodied in this simple recital of facts hurts the mind to contemplate. Much has been made of Bush's vote for the Open Housing Act of 1968, which probably did cost him re-election to the House that year. And some have said that Bush regretted the Willie Horton ad. But the fact that Bush did not traffic in the most openly retrograde white supremacy as his regular public image, in distinction from people like Reagan or Trump, and even opposed it on occasion early in his career, and may to some extent have personally regretted the times he did, only underlies his willingness to use, legitimize, and reinforce the most vile white racism when he thought the chips were down, and it would serve not just his career, but even more the needs of this system, which relies on that racism as an integral element of its social order. In the early 1980s, when a section of the ruling class brought forward the Christian fascists as a major political force, Bush set aside whatever personal, quote-unquote, social liberalism he was said to have had in order to promote what he understood to be the quote-unquote larger imperialist interests. Bush's administration opposed federal funding for abortion and unsuccessfully urged the Supreme Court to overturn the Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion. And he nominated and pushed through the appointment of the Christian fascist Clarence Thomas, widely considered the most reactionary justice on the Supreme Court. Bush became president as the HIV/AIDS epidemic grew to a massive scale, 59,000 Americans, mainly gay men, had already died. But Bush was, according to LGBT activists, quote-unquote, absent or actively hostile to the effort to find a cure, and he utterly ignored even the recommendations of his own National Commission on AIDS. Instead, Bush argued that AIDS was, quote, a disease where you can control its spread by your own personal behavior, end quote. And for the Bush administration, this did not mean education and safer sex, but total abstinence. Nostalgia for the norms. Bush was eulogized for not just respecting, but befriending, and even taking under his wing ruling class opponents like Bill Clinton, who defeated him. Bush left Clinton a world in which the U.S. seemed to be riding high, finally unchallenged. In fact, even as Bush was stepping down, deep centrifugal forces within U.S. society were being exacerbated, and new international challenges to U.S. domination began to rise. These would find expression in extremely sharp contradictions between different blocks of the ruling class. The dynamics of how that unfolded and what brought it into being are beyond the scope of this piece, but we urge you to go to Bob Avakian's The Truth About Right-Wing Conspiracy and Why Clinton and the Democrats Are No Answer, to read what was a deep-going and highly prescient analysis. The point here is that the respect that Bush generally extended to his ruling class opponents did not extend to those whom the empire he headed exploited and oppressed. The same holds true for those ex-presidents who mourned him. There is no kinder, gentler imperialism. There are no 1,000 points of light under capitalism. And whether those who eulogize Bush care or not, those are the facts. Also in this week's issue, fired for speaking truth about Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people, Professor, author, and activist Mark Lamont Hill, fired by CNN, by Carl Dix. And American Crime Case Number 97, August 6 and 9, 1945, the nuclear incineration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.